If you woke up one day with no memories of who you are, would you still be you? The role that memories play on our personal identity has been a long-standing area of exploration for many. Do our memories create the story of us, or is it the story of us that create our memories? It's like the chicken and the egg scenario, what came first? Intuitively, we want to believe that memories create our story, but time and time again, research has shown that our memories are largely unreliable and sometimes outright confabulations. From large life events such as having vivid memories of being abducted by aliens, to small everyday things like our memories and ability to recall them, changing depending on if we were in a good or bad mood during the experience. I'll return to all of this in a minute. Cold War Zombies has started a brand new trajectory for the Aether story, which is now dubbed the Dark Aether story. It's lost many of the elements from the previous iterations in that so far there doesn't seem to be a multiverse anymore after the collapse in Tactor Toten, and we aren't able to time travel yet, as well as losing many of the fantastical elements players had come to experience from Origins onwards. Instead, this time we're taken through a more grounded, typical science fiction story. The game takes place during the Cold War era after the events of Vanguard, where Nazi scientists had opened a portal to a new dimension filled with a powerful substance called Ethereum. It becomes a race between Eastern and Western forces to weaponize this substance during the events of Cold War, culminating in players finding out that everything and everyone was just being manipulated by Richtofen to achieve its end goal of the elusive Project Janus. Now, you guys probably already know me. I'm not here to explain the sequence of events that took place during the games. There's already great videos here on YouTube that can take you through them. Instead, I'm here to explore what any of it actually means. Cold War's more grounded approach did present me with a few challenges in doing so. Despite the hundreds of pieces of intel and numerous quests, I found it difficult to draw out any greater meaning from this story like I could in previous iterations, which presented more ambiguously in its storytelling, leaving room for us to project our own meanings and interpretations onto the sequence of events that took place. But hold on to that idea of projecting meaning onto the unknown, because it actually does become quite important as we move on to discussing the Dark Aether story later on. At the heart of Cold War's Dark Aether story is the importance memories play in our lives and our individuality. This isn't the first time Treyarch has explored concepts related to memory. In fact, we can feel its presence across all of their games, including their other modes like campaign and multiplayer. In Dark Aether though, exposure to Ethereum begins to erode us of our memories and therefore our identities. We become zombies in the philosophical sense, but also in the literal sense that we see in game. Players spend their time completing the first main quest in Die Machine with the objective of decontaminating the Ethereum from a megaton, which restores just enough brain function that when he's presented with a picture of his family that players collect, his memories begin to return and he's able to relate to his former sense of self again, or love. In return, he helps us destroy the machine and players move on to the events of Firebase C. The importance of memories once again becomes apparent, not only through the collection of memories from the mimics that equip us with the codes for the floppy disk, but also through the creation of the Truth Serum located within the map that we use on Dr. Pet. Its original purpose was to see if it can be used on Russians returning from the Dark Aether, experiencing Ethereum-induced amnesia, to pry valuable information from them. But there is also a very important character introduced in this map experiencing our own kind of amnesia, one not caused by Ethereum, and that is of course Samantha Maxis. One of the next videos I release on this channel will be an in-depth psychoanalysis of Samantha Maxis. She's been through a lot in her lifetime, and I think attempting to understand her inner world might give us clues to understanding what's happening in the in-game universe. If you don't know who I am, I'm a practicing student therapist currently in my postgraduate with lived experience of both PTSD and dissociative disorders, so I love diving into media representations of trauma. And having growing up with Samantha Maxis playing a central role in the zombie story, I want to ensure I dedicate a whole video to explaining her journey throughout childhood right into adulthood. In Firebase C though, we instantly notice something is up with Samantha even before the map is released with its promotional image. Here we can see Samantha's face split into two, with one side having glowing eyes, facial markings and shorter hair compared to the other half. In modern popular media, these are major tropes used to convey that our character is experiencing an inner fragmentation, either through dissociative disorder or a more fictitious portrayal such as a superpowered evil side. She essentially has at least two sides of her, unaware of the other. There's the quote-unquote good side that we see throughout the game's main narrative, where she wants to help us out and save the world, even sacrificing herself at the end of the game in the name of being a good soul. However, if you use her operator inside of the game, you begin to see a different side of her, one that appears a bit more sadistic while she angrily yells at the poor zombies that she's killing, manically laughing almost as if she's enjoying it. We also begin to see glimpses of this side of her in the intel, one where she had brutally murdered Omega soldiers and continued to stab their dead corpses out of anger, yet she has no memories of doing it.
When I opened my eyes, there was blood on my hands. stared at it, not knowing if it was mine. Then I saw the bodies. Omega soldiers. They looked like victims of a frenzied attack. An attack that continued even after they were dead. I have a knife. I do not remember where it came from. I just want to go home.
And we even see this again when everyone at Requiem begins questioning her role in the zombie outbreak at Firebase C.
Requiem are very interested in the gaps in your memory regarding the events at Outpost 25, particularly its destruction and the question of your role in it.
I was angry and confused. But that doesn't mean I could somehow unleash all the forces of the Dark Aether upon Omega.
Well, I was thinking your anger was perhaps directed more at Peck. I would understand the desire for revenge.
You really think I had the power to do that, Strauss?
I'm more concerned about the possibility of you doing it again.
Don't worry. I'm not a danger to you. Or anyone else.
What about yourself?
Don't you have other things to do, Strauss?
It becomes quite apparent to the player as more intel is released that she was indeed responsible. So what's going on? Well, unlike everyone else, Samantha's seeming memory loss isn't a result of Ethereum. It's actually in response to traumatic stress. It seems whenever something traumatic happens to her, our other side takes control, which also happens to coincidentally have magical powers. More on that in a future video. This knowledge is used later in the game by Richtofen to draw those powers out of her. First by trying to electrocute her like Peck did prior to Firebase C, then later resorting to threatening someone that she cares about. She's like a human battery, except we pump her with trauma and stress instead of souls and Ethereum. Richtofen's physical and mental torture works as she's able to use these powers while the good side of her is still in conscious control. We can see this as we move into the final map where she takes on the Forsaken. It seems she's actually become at least somewhat aware of her fragmentation, with her saying this just before entering the boss fight. The enemy within, again, is the name of another popular trope to signify that the hero and enemy of the story are one and the same person, which doesn't exactly make sense on the surface given that the Forsaken seems to be the big bad of the story and Samantha has no connection to Zygote. Or was Richtofen the real big bad? But hey, we've still got more games to go, and since everyone seems to be an unreliable narrator here with wonky memories, it's anyone's best guess. Memories also play a part in MW3's story, where the Forsaken uses the memories of Vogel, the guy that originally opened the Dark Aether portal, to manipulate Valentina into taking on the identity of his daughter with the goal of releasing him.
I have seen many things in my travels. For all its horror, there is beauty in this deep dark ether. The crystals, they take our memories. They make us forget who we were. But our memories do not fade. They are taken from us and form something new, something magical. Orbs. I have seen many in my time here. So many memories, so many stories to tell. Memories of a Russian scientist, of an American spy. There is one orb. It is different, special. It is like me. It can cross between worlds. It is filled with the laughter of a child. I may never learn who the child is or what happened to them, but their memories are powerful.
Here we can also see Peter, one of the lost souls within the Dark Aether, explaining to players that our memories actually form the orbs that players see throughout the game, including those in Outbreak. The child could be in reference to Samantha Maxis, given that she has no memories of her childhood, or they could be the mysterious child that Samantha and Weaver supposedly killed prior to the events of Cold War. We finish off Cold War with the Forsaken ultimately failing to achieve his goal of world domination. On the surface, this pursuit can seem admirable given that his time in the Dark Aether was spent watching not only Earth repeat atrocities through our historical conflicts, but also the Dark Aether with its warring factions. He managed to consume the Elder Gods that reside in that dimension, bringing unity under his reign, but also wanting to replicate that unity here on Earth and bring an end to the constant wars that we get ourselves into. But at what cost? We'd all lose our memories and our identity, becoming mindless zombies to join his horde, roaming around the planet for eternity. I do find it quite fascinating that a human like Samantha can somehow take on and win a fight against a being that has consumed countless abstract cosmic entities. The math really ain't mathin', but the show must go on. Vanguard brings a brand new chapter for the Dark Aether story. Now, I know this installment under-delivered on the gameplay front, with many players having their criticisms of the map, quests, and enemy designs. However, I really enjoyed this story, and there's so many important things happening here that I hope by the end of this video, you'll have a newfound appreciation for this installment, at least from the narrative side. Vanguard takes a total 180 from the previous Cold War story. Instead of the grounded sci-fi approach, players are taken through a supernatural story filled with cosmic horror, occultism, and lots of cool world building. And remember what I said at the very beginning about how we can project our worldview onto something unknown or ambiguous? This is what's happening here with the Dark Aether. The main narrator and the character who takes us through the events of Vanguard, Gabriel Kraft, is a practicing demonologist, so the story is told through his background in the esoteric sciences and occultism. The Elder Gods players come into contact with throughout the game all present in demonic forms, again hinting at the fact that the story is being told through Kraft's perspective. These Elder Gods would take on various forms depending on the storyteller's unique worldview. For the Greeks, for example, they'd see these demons in the form of deities they worshipped from their time. As players are taken through the story, we're introduced to the main conflict presented between Gabriel Kraft, who's taken on the wise old man archetype, contrasting Von List, who's the narcissistic Nazi man-child hell-bent on using the forces of the Dark Aether to map out his big revenge plot. The interplay between these two opposite characters bring us the driving force of the story. As players will come to know, however, Von List ultimately fails. He's betrayed by Cortifex, his Dark Aether companion, and transported very conveniently to the room Kraft is locked inside of, who ends up shooting him after discovering Von List had actually killed his husband prior to the game beginning. The players finish the final boss fight in epic punching out Cthulhu style, and the good guys won the day. But did they? As we spoke about earlier, Treyarch loves telling their stories through unreliable narrators because it allows them to bamboozle players with major plot twists in their finales. We can see it across all of Zombies and their campaigns as well. Unreliable narrators are used in stories typically related to mental health, the exploration of memories like I touched on earlier, and to help players or the audience go along with a hidden agenda that otherwise we wouldn't follow if we knew what was really happening. In the first couple of cases, the narrator isn't actually aware that they're being unreliable, they're just given their own version of the truth. In the latter, however, the narrator is deliberately deceiving players or even themselves. This type of story invites us to become detectives, using our skills of discernment, rationality, and reality testing to uncover what really may be going on. This device has been used in the making of some of my own personal favourite stories and has become popular, especially in modern media. When you take into consideration that all the way back at World at War and Black Ops 1, players loved becoming detectives and knowledge seekers. Eventually, Treyarch recognised this and began hiding the story elements behind radios, diaries, songs, and eventually hidden main quests. Which, in a way, I find quite ironic because players also began overly identifying with the perspective of who was telling the story at the time, not showing the same level of skepticism as they would in game, despite the fact that Element 115 made everyone delusional, prone to memory loss, and unable to tell dreams from reality, but hey ho! For example, players would see a rock in the game and spend months pondering its purpose or if there was something else going on with it, but major pieces of narrative were taken as objective truth, to the point players eventually started believing in crazy apothecons and omnipotent gods like Dr. Monty, despite there being quite large contradictions. In fact, players seem to outright avoid new information that contradicts their understanding of the in-game universe. This isn't all too different from real life, especially at the moment where online and news spaces seem to be filled with unreliable narrators sharing misinformation, conspiracies, and stories with hidden agendas, forcing us all to use these skills not only in-game but also in our daily life to discern objective reality from subjective worldviews or self-serving agendas. agendas. With all that in mind, let's jump back into Vanguard's story with our detective hats on to see if we can prove that Kraft is indeed reliable. If he is reliable, the information learned could have quite big ramifications for the future of the Dark Aether story. The first place we'd be looking at is the secondary characters within the Vanguard story itself that can verify Kraft's retelling of events. However, here we encounter our very first problem and major red flag. The events of Vanguard are trapped in a self-contained bubble with very little or to no interaction with the outside world. The only other character that provides a secondary account is Von List himself. So surely Von List can prove that Kraft is reliable. Well, not quite. Von List frequently interrupts Kraft throughout the game, implying that he's not telling players the whole truth. So then, let's take a look at Cold War. Since the game took place decades after Vanguard, surely there's going to be some evidence from prior events. Again, no. While there is some old scraps found within the Dark Aether from Kraft, no other character can actually verify any of the events that took place. In fact, Cold War raises some more questions given that we don't actually see any of these entities or Elder Gods, which sure can be put down to Zykov consuming them within the Dark Aether, but even his own diary within the Dark Aether shows his descent into madness. Initially not being able to recall any details of these Elder Gods when he first enters, but begins to believe in them only after crazy cultists begin repeating the stories to him. You would think out of the hundreds of people that have entered the Dark Aether by now, someone could verify the existence of these Elder Gods. In fact, the only mention we have to the events of Vanguard within Cold War was a piece of intel between Kravchenko and Jaeger, who appears to be Von List's great nephew. Fantastic! Surely he could confirm it is true since he's related to him. Well...
I have read your file. You are related to Oberführer Wolfram von List, the fabled leader of the SS unit Die Wahrheit. He faced similar entities, yes? What was its name? Ah, yes. Kotif.
Tread carefully, Colonel. There are certain names best left not said aloud. While it is true my great-uncle pursued certain obsessions, I am afraid I was privy to little that would be helpful for our situation.
Is that so?
Unfortunately, sometimes the myth is larger than the man. They were just stories, Colonel. Stories to scare children.
How disappointing. That will be all, Doctor. Have a good night.
I can see myself out. Some doors are closed for a reason, Colonel. Do not open this one.
You could interpret this in two ways. The first being that Jaeger knows more than he's letting on, that he's reducing the events of Vanguard to mere myth and stories because he knows if people believe them to be true, then that opens the door again for these entities to exist or to return in the future. Or the second scenario being that they literally are just nothing more than mere stories from a madman like Von List. Or maybe a mixture of both. Whichever way you want to interpret it, it still doesn't verify what actually happened during Vanguard. In fact, it has the opposite effect, casting me more doubt. What we do get from this account, however, is that we know now Von List was at least a real person, so that's something we can score off. Oh, post-editing Chantel here, I forgot to add that there was actually references to the Dark Aether gods in the final map Forsaken, but it was just more scrap papers from a mysterious Dark Aether character named Sporagmus. Given that Kraft has bonded with these Dark Aether entities and survives at the end of Vanguard with no mention of him still being on Earth, it's still within realm of possibility that this character is actually Gabriel Kraft himself, who has spent the past few decades studying the Dark Aether with the goal of eventually wanting to bring his friends back, the Elder Gods, after the Forsaken. Another thing to note here is that while we gain our powers or specialist abilities in Vanguard through our bonds and artifacts with the Dark Aether entities, in Cold War we're able to derive the exact same effects without them, instead gaining them through a more science fiction approach like the distillation of Ethereum. And the final clue to Kraft being an unreliable narrator lies in his own narration. Quite often we see him completely contradicting his own version of events. Of course, these things can be put down to just sloppy writing. We can't discount that, especially given that the writers at Treyarch were racing against the clock to write the dialogue for each of the maps. Going beyond his own narration, however, his motivations don't exactly add up either. Initially telling players that he refused to serve Von List in very noble fashion, only doing so to save his husband that Von List had previously captured. Coincidentally, every time that Kraft has some major breakthrough on obtaining these fantastical artifacts, is exactly when Von List would remind him of his husband Sasha. Very coincidental. Von List continues to encourage Kraft's cooperation by giving him letters from Sasha, but it was obvious from the get-go that Sasha had already died. So why did Kraft wait until the very end to accept this? Was he simply in denial, holding on to a fantasy similarly to what Von List is doing? Or is there something more sinister going on here? How does he know what the Tome of Rituals looked like if only the Secret Society had ever saw it? We may get more confirmation as future installments in Dark Aether are released. I loved Kraft as a character, and I found it very easy to identify with his perspective, given that he was so kind and virtuous on the surface. But I know I just need some more solid evidence before I begin fully trusting this character. What's so important about Kraft being an unreliable narrator anyway? Well, it puts the whole story into question since we primarily are introduced to the in-game world of Vanguard through his lens. Is he not the kind and benevolent wise old man that the game portrays? Are him and Von List closer than what meets the eye? Is he misleading or misdirecting players to suit his own agenda? Or is it all simply just a story being written by a fragmented madman brought to life by some Dark Aether woo-woo for players to play through? What would this mean for the whole Dark Aether saga? These possibilities open the door for a nested story to take place, essentially a story within a story. As Zombies players, we've come to love the fantastical maps we've been playing through this past decade. Not only have they brought us insanely cool map designs, but also unique system designs and enemy designs depending on the map genre. When Cold War released, many players felt that it was lacking in personality and that we were just moving from military base to military base. I'd go a step further and say that it wasn't just lacking in personality, but it was lacking in those unique fantastical elements players had come to expect and love from a Treyarch Zombies experience. With Call of Duty as a whole looking to integrate all of its games and storylines into one unified timeline including Zombies, this means that Zombies will be forced to continue on the more realistic, grounded and science fiction path. A nested story, however, allows for the best of both worlds. We could still have the main overarching story that players see in Cold War and the campaigns, while introducing an embedded story like the one in Vanguard. We can experience continued genre shift depending on the individual storyteller's worldview. Like we saw with Vanguard and Kraft being a demonologist, we got cool shit centered around occultism like the Tome of Rituals and Covenants that shaped the way we played these maps. Or even take Alistair Rhodes from the Chaos story, whose background was in world mythologies prior to the events of Black Ops 4 taking place. It's no coincidence that the maps we play through all incorporate Celtic, Egyptian, Nordic and Greek mythologies, creating again these really cool opportunities for designs and gameplay mechanics that shape the way we experience and played the maps. In fact, Kraft actually makes direct reference to Alistair Rhodes' stories during the events of Vanguard, suggesting that this nested story is indeed already taking place. And sure, you could chalk it up to the writers just nodding at each other, but I personally don't like that interpretation. It's like Chekhov's gun. You can't really introduce an element to the story that's completely unnecessary, especially a gun as big as referencing the Chaos story within another story, and especially not to starved Zombies fans who would love nothing more than to see Chaos return. Not only is it unnecessary at that point, but oddly cruel. Overall, using a nested story doesn't just have in-game implications for Zombies players, but also practical real-world implications for the studio. It allows for new writers who are titans in their respective genres to join Call of Duty and leave their own individual mark on the franchise, without having to be super familiar with the 6,000 entries on the timeline and the intricacies that went into Zombies in the past. They have the opportunity to utilise the nested story device to tell a brand new story within the overarching story. As much as I love Craig Houston and his team's writing, I don't see an end to Call of Duty as a franchise, and I hope that team can retire one day. There's also another way this device is useful, in that we can take elements and designs from previous stories told. Think about the amount of money and manpower that went into creating the Chaos story, for example. It'd be a real shame if we never got to use any of its elements again, and was just doomed to sit floating forever alone in the past. Dark Aether for me ultimately is symbolic of the unknown, the great beyond, waiting for any imaginative writer to stumble upon it and project it with the contents of their creative minds. Similar to how the humans of old would look up at the vastness of space and fill it with stories of gods, of conflicts and of creation. But as we began exploring space, we began to see these stories weren't representative of universal truths, but instead represented our personal truths. We thought we were mapping out the universe, instead we were mapping out ourselves. In a really meta upon meta way, I'm doing the exact same with these videos. They might tell you more about me than they do the actual story itself, but you guys seem to enjoy it, so I'll continue doing it. Until next time, guys.